Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast. Jacob, how you doing?
Fired up, man. I'm always fired up, especially when you have Josh Driver on the podcast.
Yeah, so Josh Driver, one thing I want to jump right into with Monday's episode is the whole idea of like a buck's core area. And that was the big thing with that episode. And what Josh talked about is a buck's core area is just a manifestation of what he needs. So it's food, cover, water, and a safe place. That's all it is. And so you can kind of strip away everything else from it. And if you have food, cover, and water in a safe area, you're going to have a buck, because it's like the area almost creates the buck. You know, it's not like the buck went and found it per se, even though he might have, but like that combination of thing produces that buck, and that's where you find them. Mm-hmm. And that's huge, man. And this is honestly a really good refresher listening to that, because it's been so long. This was in December 2019 when we originally recorded that, and it was nice going back and listening to it, because I haven't listened to it in so long, and just all the little things that I completely forgot about that we talked about in that episode. So it was a fun listen. But what are your thoughts on the core area thing?
Well, before we go into that, I'm going to go to the core area. I apologize to all the listeners, because I forgot to mention this in the intro for that episode. We are using much different equipment now and got a little bit more tech savvy. So the audio from that episode, it's not terrible. Well, if you're used to like what you've been used to listening for like the last year and a half or so, or last 2 years, the last 3 years, really, it is a little bit different. So apologize about that.
It's a little bit different. We're clipping a little bit, recording a little hot.
Absolutely. And a little background noise. Also, I will say this as well, for context for that episode, we were interviewing him during our rut in Alabama, which was in December.
Yeah.
So we kind of go out of a little bit different perspective in that episode compared to like when y'all listen to it now in September. A little bit different format, but again, there's a lot of takeaways from what Josh is talking about that he does in September and October that again we can apply down here in the Southeast during this early part of the season, which is great timing for it. But going back to the core area thing, that is a really good point when he's talking about like the area almost like manifests as the buck.
Yeah.
Like those core areas are gonna be good year after year. Like every now and then the buck dies. It may go a year or two without a buck being there. But at some point, you're going to have another mature buck move into those spots. So that's what Josh was talking about. It's like once you find a bunch of core areas that you're getting mature bucks in, it's almost like you have a spot you've got to hunt, at least in that early part of the season, maybe even later part of the season, kind of post-rut, that you can kind of focus on it and kill bucks. And like you said, because he focuses so much time on the core areas, he doesn't really like hunting the rut because it's so, that buck could be, as he says in the podcast, that buck could be here one day, 3 miles the next day.
Yeah,
and that's also, man, there's so much to talk about with this as well. That also goes into when he's talking about like with these core areas, especially early season core areas, how in his experience hunting Kentucky on public land, you can't. It's kind of hard to like completely blow that buck out of that area where he doesn't come back to it. It's like it's possible, like definitely enough pressure going in there. Like he may shift areas or shift areas just a little bit where like you're not going to see him during legal hours. Like he's going to be back a little bit farther than that thick stuff. He's going to maybe linger a little bit more before he comes out. But where a lot of guys, and you hear this all the time on the podcast, we hear this from a lot of listeners, a lot of you guys and viewers on the YouTube channel about like bumping bucks and like they're gone forever. You see that all the time on social media, especially on Facebook. People mention all the time, like, man, I bumped the buck. Is he ever going to show back up again? And Josh makes a really good point. A lot of times that happens, it's kind of getting close to that rut time period when those bucks are really starting to expand their home ranges. And yeah, in that case, if he feels like there's a excess pressure in one area, he might not come and revisit that during daylight hours because he doesn't have to.
Or he might just be gone because he wasn't coming back anyway.
That's true as well. So you're like, man, he's gone. Like I bumped him and he's gone as well. It's during the rut. So, he's already going to be moving around a whole bunch. Now, every buck's a little bit different. They all have like slightly different personalities. Some are a little bit more homebodies. Some are a little bit more roamers. So that also plays into a factor for it. But I thought that was a really good point about, even in his area, he's like, I'm not worried about bumping that buck when I go in and scout a spot and check a spot. Mm-hmm. He's like, I just don't want to bump him multiple times.
Yeah, don't bump him over and over and over again. Yeah, that makes total sense. I love that. And probably my favorite thing, like my favorite theme of what he was talking about was stripping away the basically the logic and the decision making of the deer. And this just for a little bit more context, this is like 2019, so this is when like the hunting beast was like really like I think kind of at its height. Like everyone was talking about like the buck bedding and he's bedding with this wind and he's watching that access point and he's monitoring hunters and this and that. And a lot of people, myself included, kind of fell into this thing of where you're kind of thinking yourself in circles with these deer. You're like, well, why is he doing that? And Josh made the point where it's like, well, it doesn't matter why he's doing it. He's an animal. Like, he can't think like a person can think. You know, he can't reason. He can't use logic. And so if you try to apply logic to what a deer is doing, you're going to think yourself in a big circle because it just doesn't work. You know, like, they don't think like we do. And that directly relates back to what he's talking about, where a hub is just a manifestation of that buck's needs. You know, like, or a core, I meant, not a hub, where, like, a buck doesn't know what, like, a hub is. There I go again. Well, I mean, a hub too, or a core area. Like, he doesn't know what a core area is. So they're just acting based off of instinct and conditioning. You know, if that buck is laying next to the parking lot, it's because nobody hunts there, and he gets away with it. Is the point that Josh is making? He's like, that buck isn't necessarily going and being like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to watch for when these bow hunters are coming into the woods, and I'm going to go to where they always park, and I'm going to wait till they get here, and then I'm going to slip out the backside. You know, like, I found that part really interesting because over the years, you know, since we did that episode, I found that when I kind of go back and I strip away the logic that I'm trying to apply to the deer, I always do better. You know, whenever I get in like a mental jam and I can't figure out what I want to go do, or I get stuck on a spot that it just isn't working out, it's always because of that. Most of the time, it's because I'm trying to apply logic to something that is not logical.
Yeah. No, I can see that. Also, something else about, like, the core areas that I thought was fascinating is how, you know, he's gotten so good at finding these core areas on the map. You know, he'll go, like, on Onyx, pull up the map, pull, you know, aerial imagery, and then literally pick out spots that would make sense for him as not as thermal hubs.
I know, I screwed you up now.
Yeah, I know. But as core areas, and he'll go in there and run his trail cameras. And, like, one of the biggest things that he's looking for is habitat diversity. And I'll say Josh's episode has been by far probably the most impactful episode for me and Andrew both, as in some of the things that we've been focusing on the last 4 years. You know, after doing this podcast and interviewing him, is, you know, focusing a lot on habitat edges, focusing a lot on terrain features, and focusing a lot on just habitat edges and compounding features. I'll be honest, I don't think we had ever heard about the term compounding features before this episode. Got it. Also, I don't think we had ever heard about before this episode what a thermal hub was, what a high crow's foot is, social hubs, all that kind of stuff. Me and Andrew personally learned that from this specific episode, along with, you know, thousands of you that listen to this podcast and been listening to the podcast for a long time. Now, a lot of your new listeners that are listening and watching right now, maybe you hadn't heard this episode previously. But even if you have, it's a really good refresher, like what Andrew was talking about. It's a really good refresher to be able to kind of re-spark your brain and really kind of think about this kind of stuff. Because the way Josh goes about doing it, it's not overcomplicating anything. It's like Andrew was saying, you know, and Josh said in the podcast, you need food, cover, and water. And that security is part of that cover aspect. Yep. With the cover, you're looking for the habitat edges. You're looking for a lot of diversity, so a lot of different plant varieties in one general area. And like in our area, and kind of like what Josh talks about, in areas where there's a lot of logging that happens, like in a lot of the southeast, if you're in any kind of area, rolling hills where agriculture, when it comes to like traditional farming practices, whether it's, you know, with cattle or it's with, you know, planted row crops, outside of that, the only other kind of, you know, that kind of industry in the southeast for the most part is going to be, you know, timber harvesting, with a lot of timber company properties, whether you're on a hunting lease, your personal, you know, property that you own or have a lease on, or if you're hunting public land, you deal with a lot of that in the southeast. And what Josh is talking about is trying to find a lot of those habitat diversities in those kind of areas where maybe you have a couple different age clear cuts coming up to each other, where you have one that's a fresh clear cut or 2 or 3 year old clear cut. You get that one that's 5 or 6 years old, and you get those pine trees that are growing back there now 10, 12 years old, all around some of these SMZs, these streamside management zones, where you have these hardwood ranges kind of all fingering through it. So you have a bunch of different habitat edges all in one spot, and that's the kind of things that he's kind of keying in on. That, you know, has all the habitat diversity. It's got great food sources with all those clear cuts and also mass crops there, and also, you know, potentially, especially if one of those hardwood ranges, one of those SMZ streamside management zones, there's a very good likelihood that one of those has water in it at some point. You know, if you're in a drought, of course that stuff can go dry, but if you have some kind of stream, creek, retention pond, something like that can hold water, he's got that there as well. So he's got everything in one spot, and once you kind of notice that, and you can pick that up on a map, you can kind of walk yourself into some of those positions in order to get on deer. And that's something that I think we've, had a lot more success with after this podcast, is looking for that kind of stuff and really using it to our personal advantage and killing a lot more deer because of that. Again, because of what Josh has talked about in this specific episode. So again, it's been highly impactful for us, and let alone all the listeners that's previously heard this episode and actually implemented what Josh has talked about. Also, I'll say this. When it comes to his trail cam strategy, I thought was really interesting. So when we originally interviewed Josh, it was probably 3 months, 3.5 months or so before we had interviewed another gentleman who's from Alabama named Jeff Homan, who's been on the podcast a couple times now, maybe.
Yeah, that was episode 122, and we actually did that as a classic, quote unquote, throwback episode last year.
Yep.
So a lot of people probably heard that one.
And that episode was, I think, titled Backtracking Bucks with Jeff Homan.
Yep.
Where he uses trail cameras. He does a lot like what Josh talks about, but he kind of does it in a slightly different way. But he will throw trail cameras out in those highly diverse areas. We have a bunch of different habitat edges all in one spot. And once he gets those bucks on camera, he'll slowly start moving those cameras back, especially if he's catching them in the evenings or even in the mornings, whether he's catching them going back to bed or he's catching them coming from a bedding area. He'll slowly move his cameras every 5 to 7 days slightly closer and kind of leapfrog that past camera to get closer to where he thinks that buck's going and try to catch him on camera again, a little bit earlier in the evening or a little bit later in the morning as he's going back to bed or, again, leaving his bed in the evening until he gets that buck, right around when opening season comes and season opener happens, where he's catching that buck on camera multiple times throughout the day, both in the morning and the evening during daylight hours, and that's when he knows he's ready to go kill that deer. When he has that kind of pattern, he knows he's that close to potentially where that buck's laying down and spending all of his time.
Another thing I wanted to talk about, and we kind of danced around it a little bit, was the social hub versus a thermal hub thing. I found that interesting because another thing I pretty much completely forgot about from this episode, a thermal hub being where a couple of creek drainages come together at a higher elevation. So if you have your ridge system, this is going to be, Josh said, basically halfway to 3/4 the way up the ridge. Whereas your social hub is going to be your huge hubs where like 2 or 3 major creeks come together all the way down in the very bottoms where the big creeks are. Not where the little dry branches and stuff go up into the hills, but where the big creeks are. Mm-hmm. And I believe he said that the social hubs are more of a rut spot for him and potentially also a good camera spot as well.
Same thing with thermal hubs.
Yeah.
More of a rut spot. But the social hubs, the way he describes in the podcast, those social hubs are catching, again, like Andrew described, multiple massive ridge systems that all drop off at one point. You're catching doe groups that potentially live on different ridge systems where if they come down to either get water or drop down in elevation to feed on mass crops or anything like that, they're all kind of congregating in that one spot, and a buck can kind of cruise that area, lay down a ton of sign, a lot of scrapes. You'll find a lot of rubs in those areas. I typically find a ton of scrapes in those areas. And again, as Josh talks about, it's much more of a rut hunting location. Now, I've known guys who have killed bucks early season in those spots where they're catching a buck kind of working a creek system up through one of those, quote-unquote, you can call it a social hub before he goes up on a ridge point to go bed.
Yep.
And you can definitely do that. Like one guy that comes to mind is our buddy Bo Martonic killed a really big buck back in, I think it was 2020 or 2021, opening day or first couple days of season in Pennsylvania, where he did that. He found where a buck was feeding, this specific buck he was trying to hunt was feeding on a clear cut that was fairly, good distance away, maybe half a mile or so away, of where he thought the deer was bedding, and he was kind of working back up that drainage system before going up onto the ridge system that the buck was bedding on, and he found a good pinch point down that creek bottom to catch that buck slipping through and killed him on a morning sit. So it can work in those areas, but really the way Josh was talking about, like, it's much more of a rut spot, which makes sense. Again, it's an area that not only are all these thermals dropping down, but all these deer are dropping down to this one specific location. And also it kind of goes back to make you think and wonder, like past guests, like Michael Perry, where he's talking about hunting creek crossings.
Yep.
Typically in those areas, you're going to find a ton of creek crossings. Like you're going to find a spot that a lot of deer are kind of going back and forth from, one ridge system to the other ridge system, crossing that creek system right there. And again, can make for a really good spot if a buck's either running a doe or he's going from one ridge system to another ridge system. He's going to go down through that social hub and come up through the other side. And again, a little more random. You don't really necessarily know what buck's going to come through there, but as he talked about, it's a really good rut spot. But also, as Josh said, He's not much of a rut hunter because he likes to hunt specific bucks. He likes to find a specific deer and kill him on a specific pattern, that food to bed pattern, before the rut craze happens and that deer potentially disappears.
Yeah. If someone is like a very hands-on type learner and they like to like do something themselves to really learn, and you're still wondering about like what a thermal hub, or in this case maybe more specifically a social hub, looks like, one way that you can do it that's very hands-on, that I've did this like years ago when I was first learning all this stuff, is if you go on Onyx, you can draw polygons on there, and basically turn your topo map on, find a hill, basically find a creek with a hill next to it, start at the creek. If you got like 10 topo lines going from the bottom of the creek to the top of the hill, pick like the middle one and start drawing a polygon and just trace that line and go all the way around the hill. You know, at some point you might have to like kind of cut it off and like kind of jump over the top of the hill, but go follow that topo line and go all the way around the hill, and then do it to the other hill across the creek, and just do that to like 2 or 3 ridge systems where you're going to go around and you know, click, 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 and draw these big polygons, and then zoom out and look at what they all look like together. So you'll have like a big solid polygon, like, oh, here's one ridge system, here's one ridge system, here's one ridge system, and they're all highlighted. You just drew them in yourself, and then you can very obviously see those social hubs between them, because it looks like branches of a tree. Like those creeks look like tree branches, and where there's a big split in a tree branch, that's your social hub. So that's just a really hands-on way to do it, and it can be kind of helpful, like if you're struggling to pick apart like which ridge is which, because you know sometimes a topo map can just look like spilled spaghetti, you know, and that'll help you break it down a little bit. So that's something I've done in the past that helped me, because I'm kind of that type of learner. So I just want to throw that out there. I bet someone might find that helpful.
Also, another feature that Onyx Maps has that's super helpful to give you even more of a visual advantage or perspective if you're, again, a much more visual learner, is on the app you can switch between 2D and 3D maps. If you switch to the 3D maps on like the lower right hand side of your phone, you can actually pan up and down, and you can actually see like a 3D model of what everything looks like, which will help you out even more so, especially if you're more new at trying to read a topo map.
Yeah, that'll help you figure out a topo map.
Yeah, and that's really nice, because especially if you're in kind of hilly country, when you roll it back and you're kind of looking at the horizon in that 3D maps, you'll see all the ridge systems. You'll see all the ridge points and everything in and around that area, and it really will help you even quicker look at and try to figure out, you know, is this one of these social hubs, or are you looking at more of a thermal hub that's a little bit higher from the ridge system? And you can see it really, really easily, especially, again, if you're newer to reading topo maps and you're not comfortable reading topo maps. Is another great way to kind of cheat the system a little bit and kind of speed up that process, that learning process along the way.
Yep, absolutely. Man, one last thing about Josh before we get into some other stuff is he's like the poster child for just like having the utmost confidence. it cracked me up back when we recorded it, and now again when I listen to it, just like the utter confidence he has. He's like, well, I'll just wait for the win and I'll go in there and kill him, you know. And he talks like very matter of fact. He's like, I'll wait for that and then I'll kill him.
Yep.
You know. And I just found that interesting, because he's a good example of guys who just like, they got their thing dialed, they know how to do it, and you know, he goes out and he finds the beds, which is something that I've struggled with. You know, I've never really had success doing that. Josh has. Kind of goes back to the thing about different things work for different folks. But also Josh, again, going back to like applying logic to stuff, he also had the confidence in those beds. I think partly because he doesn't necessarily follow the wind-based bedding thing. He's like, they find a bed and they're going to bed there if they want to. If he wants to bed there, he's going to be there. It doesn't matter what the wind is, you know. And that's something that, looking back, I think of all the beds I've found, hundreds of beds over the years, that's the only explanation. Because when you try to make it work in your head, again, you sit there and you start thinking in circles.
Yep.
And I think that's one thing that maybe gave him a lot of confidence and kind of gave him an edge is again, just not letting yourself apply that logic to the deer. And man, just the way he talks about it, so matter of fact, I'm like, I want to get there one day. You know, I want to be able to talk with that amount of confidence.
Well, you know what's hilarious when you listen to that episode, and it was, again, you, me, and Mike were on there, and he talks about the buck, that 164-inch buck that he killed that was like bedding next to that little river.
Oh yeah.
And like when he shot it and everything, that
we all went,
like,
ooh,
at the same time. I mean, at the same time, it was like choreographed. It was hilarious. And like when we were listening to it today in the truck, kind of getting a refresher on this episode because it's been a while since I've listened to it. I was laughing so hard at that.
I laughed at that part.
But again, this is like an extremely impactful episode. Like this is, if someone ever asks us, of all the episodes you've done, like what is that top 1 or 2 episodes that you would recommend for new listeners? It's this episode. Every time. It's this episode.
Yep.
It might not apply directly everywhere. If you're in an area maybe without all the topography features and a lot more flat land, you can still focus on the habitat edges. No matter whether, if you're in a big river bottoms, maybe you don't have the clear cuts, you don't have all those kind of habitat edges, but you can find fallen trees. You can find where windstorms have come through, or tornadoes have come through and blown a lot of timber down. That makes a habitat edge. That makes an edge that the deer will use. And you can kind of look at that and play off that. Now, the thing is, with those kind of areas, it's a lot more boots on the ground because some of that won't show up on a map. Some of it depend on, your maps for that area and how Onyx looks in your area. It may not show that, so a lot of times you just have to walk into one of those spots, and then you realize that, hey, man, there's some really nice edges, habitat edges inside this expansive hardwood timber down these bottoms that maybe I couldn't see from the maps, but when I got in here, I could see it. I could see how the deer are using it, and then I can kind of go off of what Josh was talking about and applying it. Now, another thing I forgot to mention earlier, I was kind of going this direction, I got sidetracked, is Josh's perspective on running trail cameras. Now, he is a diehard trail cam user when it comes to, he's checking those cameras every 5 to 6, 7 days. And if he doesn't have a buck on it in that time period, especially a buck that he wants to shoot, he's moving that camera. He's not just leaving it there. And he mentioned, it's a good quote from this episode, I'm not letting the buck hunt for my camera and try to find my camera in order for me to get him on camera. I'm hunting for that buck with my trail cameras. Like, I'm moving him until I get him on camera. If I get him on camera once, okay, well, I'm going to keep moving him until I get him on camera multiple times with some kind of consistency on a consistent basis, and then keying in on that, and that's how he's building his confidence in order how and when to go about hunting that buck, picking his tree in the whole 9 yards.
I'm glad you remembered that. That was a great quote. Like, I'm not going to let the buck find my camera or something like, or like people are waiting on bucks to find their cameras. They should be finding the bucks with their cameras.
Yeah, and this is a really good aspect and a really good point that if you're hunting private land in like some of these states in the southeast that do allow baiting, and you've got corn piles or rice bran or whatever you have dumped out for deer, whether you're using a feeder or just dumped on the ground, that big buck shows up and it's 2 hours after dark. Don't try to kill that buck on that corn pile. I mean, start backtracking, kind of using like from episode 122 with Jeff Homan and what Josh Driver talked about in this episode. Start moving those cameras back in the direction that buck's coming from in the evenings until you try to catch him. Maybe you move it 100 yards further back and you catch him 45 minutes sooner. And like, okay, cool. Now you kind of leapfrog again another 100 yards and try to catch him on camera again another 45 minutes sooner until you get to the point that hopefully, of course, he's still on your property. Now, if he's off your property and coming to your property after dark, you don't have anything to work on. But if you are in a bigger hunting club, you're on a bigger lease, or you're on public land, you could actually do that. But especially for the guys on private land, hunting clubs, leases, private farm, if you can run bait, implement that. Don't wait for that buck to miraculously show up on your bait pile during daylight to go hunt it. Try to backtrack that buck a little bit further as long as you have the property to do so in order to catch him on camera, and then you'll have a lot more confidence trying to hunt that buck, especially if you're trying to kill him early season before maybe some of your neighbors get opportunities at him.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I love it. So we got a lot of other stuff to talk about too. So we covered the Tennessee velvet hunt last week. We had a dove hunt. We had a great dove hunt. Shout out to our buddy Kyle Sides of Mossy Oak Properties.
Yep.
We were able to go hunt his place, and man, that was a great shoot. We had a really good time. Got some dog work in. Man, it was fun. It was like the nicest opening day of dove season of my life.
Yeah.
It was overcast. It was kind of breezy. There was times where it kind of settled and got real like muggy.
Yeah.
But hey, look, I didn't get sunburned, and I get sunburned every year on opening day of dove season.
Yeah, it was like 85, 88 degrees. Overcast.
It's like a vacation compared to what we've had.
And then also, you mentioned this, you're like, man, this is the most like laid back dove hunt I've ever done, because typically when we've hunted public land on dove shoots, like you got to get there at daylight or before daylight to kind of quote unquote claim your spot of where you're going to sit at on like one of the dove fields. Versus with this, we all went out to lunch. There's like 20 of us, counting the kids and everything. Mm-hmm. We all go grab lunch. Kind of ease back to the truck, kind of drive over to the farm, go pick up some ice on the way there.
It's 1:30, bro.
Yeah, we get out there. It's like 1:30. It's like, it opens at noon in Alabama for opening day. And we just kind of ease out there, and
Yep.
we get guys with side by sides. We all kind of pull our trucks down through the pastures and everything. It's a big cattle farm that Kyle and his family have. Kind of pull through the pastures. We all park in a spot. They got a few side by sides running people out to this big dove field. And dude, it was nice. I'm like, dude, this is pretty handy.
It was awesome.
And
it was awesome.
And also, what made it even better is, while we're doing that, some guys go out to the field and they're all getting positions. People start shooting because doves are already flying, and we start having some circles. I'm like, man, I want to grab my shotgun. Like, I'm gonna try to shoot one right here at the truck. And dude, I get my shotgun loaded up. Had two flying over the tree line. I'm like, oh yeah, this is it. And dude, they flew by, dude. Perfect, just crossing shot. First shot, dropped one. I'm like, oh, it's gonna be a good day. It's gonna be a real good day.
Right there at the truck.
Oh, dude, it was. I'm like, that's my kind of dove hunt, man.
That was a fun hunt, dude.
Yeah.
That was a good way to kick off hunting season, man. Or at least my hunting season. You already kicked yours off.
Yep.
But so we did that, and then we've been doing a little bit of scouting slash spot prepping at the club. I think we got a lot to talk about right there. A couple weeks back, we talked about it on here. Me and my stepdad Mike went out and we found some feed trees. Basically, we found no white oaks that we could see acorns in. We could not. I couldn't see them with the binos. I was carrying some 8-power binos. Couldn't see any in the white oaks, but I did find some in water oaks. And the water oaks specifically were just loaded down, like very impressive mass crop this year. Same thing with red oaks. Found them in some red oaks. Found some persimmon trees, and we wanted to go back and prep this one particular spot, just because it's kind of, speaking of like a compounding feature. There's a pine thicket with a ditch coming out of it that kind of empties out right where there's a water oak on the edge of that thicket.
It's a little SMZ. It's got some timber on it.
Yeah, it's got a little bit of timber on it, but it comes down out of the pine thicket and empties out right there. There's deer traveling on it. There were scrapes there last year when we initially found it. We found it when we were blood trailing a doe I shot out there last year. And there's a creek crossing, so it's adjacent to the creek, and there's a pretty nice creek crossing that we also found with that doe last year. And this oak is just kind of like right there on the edge, and I think it's going to be a really good spot where you're going to have deer traveling the edge but also coming down out of the pine thicket. So again, you get that T-shaped travel where they're kind of intersecting each other. And then also I think you're going to have deer parallel in the creek. So it's just got a lot going for it. And there's also some more oaks in there kind of around that creek that you'll be able to shoot to. But more importantly, it's just going to hold deer in the area. So I wanted to go back in there and basically prep that spot because the timber's pretty thick. Like there's a good understory, and it'd be just kind of difficult to get a shot. So I brought the pole saw in there. And we went in there and started prepping that spot, and dude, we got it looking good.
Yep.
Good. We got two nice lanes cut. You'll be able to see a lot. It's like a big 4-trunked maple tree that kind of comes up and splits. Like they're never going to see you up in there. You got great cover from both sides. It's just a spot just made in heaven, man. Now, we prepped it, and I'm probably going to hunt it a bunch of times and never see anything. That'd be my luck. But threw a camera out, too. Made a little open up the scrape.
Few cameras out.
Well, in that spot, we threw a camera out, and then we threw another one on that creek crossing. One kind of neat thing about that spot, too, is that it's also kind of a natural pinch point. Just because of how the creek meanders through there, and it's kind of channeled out a little bit, and it's kind of dug out some channels that are up in the woods a little bit. And it's not like a hard pinch point or anything. It's not like a bluff, but it does kind of, I don't know, like persuade movement, I guess.
Yeah, one thing we've noticed on that creek, on that property, is it's a very shallow creek for the most part. I mean, with hip waders, you could walk up majority of the whole creek without going over hip waders, but some of it's very gradual. Like the land is really gradual come down to the water, so like you can easily just walk right down, and that's where you find a lot of crossings at. And other places like what you're talking about, where it's a little more, it meanders a little bit more, it's got a little more curves to the creek, and it cuts out the bank. You got a 3, 4, 5 foot tall bank. Even though the water's not very deep, the water might only be 16, 18 inches deep. We don't really see, or haven't really seen, a bunch of crossing on those little drops. It's like they're kind of working their way a little bit further around until they get to a much more gentle slope to cross the creek. Which is pretty nice. And again, in that spot, you've got one of those cut banks right adjacent to the tree stand, probably 40 yards from the tree stand.
Yeah, exactly. It's probably more like 30, 35. And when we were walking in there, we brought Tiffany and Piper with us because Tiffany wanted to be out there with us and kind of see where we're hunting. And Tiffany's very interested in actually trying to kill a deer this year. She actually asked if I could put her in for some SOA hunts. I was like, heck yeah, I can put you in, and I'll be your guest. Like, this is going to be doubling my odds, bro.
Dang, That's a good point.
That's why you should get married, dude.
Yeah.
So we were walking in. We had prepped a spot the day before. So we went out, what was it, Sunday and Monday, because of Labor Day. And we had prepped that spot the day before. We were going back in Monday to change the cameras out because we put 2 cell cams out and neither of them were working. So we went back in to go ahead and change it. And you and Mike were like kind of behind us, and me and her were walking up front. And we were just kind of walking and talking, and we got to basically where the tree stand was, and she didn't know where we were, but I was like, hey, you see how like the creek meanders? And I'm explaining that. And she's like, she basically said something like, well, would this be like a pinch point? And I'm like, yes, because of how the creek comes in right here, and you see how it like pinches in and how we're naturally just kind of flowing through this one spot. She's like, yeah, like we just kind of, it's like the path of least resistance. I was like, well, there's the tree. And she was like, oh my gosh, because the tree was like right there behind us. I'm like, this is what the deer are going to, like, that's how the deer perceives this. They're just going to be kind of meandering through here, hopefully, and they're just naturally going to want to walk around the edge of this cut bank that they can easily climb over, they can easily jump down, but it's just easy walking for them, if they don't have a reason to not walk there. And so I just thought that was kind of cool, like with her, that was kind of fun.
No, that is a hot tip that some people might have just overheard or overlooked, is when you're out scouting and you're walking areas, especially whether it's flatland, whether it's hill country or mountainous stuff, when you're in a spot and you're like, man, this is pretty easy walking, especially if it's an area that's in general isn't super easy walking. If you start looking down, you're going to see deer tracks. Like the deer, like if you are taking the path of least resistance when you're scouting, a lot of the deer are going to do the exact same thing. Mature buck may or may not, depending on the time of the year, but your general deer, your does, your young bucks are going to be on that path of travel as well. So that's a really big thing. If you're walking through a pine thicket and it's crazy thick and you get to like a little opening, a logging road or something like that, or old skid steer road that like cuts through that pine thicket, you're going to find deer sign, you're going to find scrapes, you're going to find rubs there, and you're also going to find trails on those opening areas just because it's a path of least resistance for those deer. And again, down those river bottoms, those creek bottoms, it's like you were kind of like meandering through, and it's like, there's kind of scattered deer, so the second it pinches down, it's like, oh, okay, here's a lot of tracks. Like they're pinching down this one spot. And if you kind of just start paying attention to that from your perspective of when you're walking through, and like, man, this is in general, like a fairly easy walk going through this stuff compared to everything else around it. Typically, you're going to find a lot of deer on there, and that's also a great spot to put trail cameras. Like those path of least resistance, going through some of that cover around different obstructions is a spot that if you put a trail camera there, there's a very good likelihood you're going to get some deer on camera. You may or may not get a mature buck, but you're probably going to get some deer on camera if you focus on some of that stuff when you're actually out there scouting.
Yeah, 100%. We also, man, we already had some trail cameras out there, and basically we were focusing on this creek on a bunch of different creek crossings because this property is basically cut right in half with that creek. And so, I mean, obviously it stands to reason that if deer are going to be going back and forth across the property, they have to cross that creek. And again, they can kind of cross it wherever they want. But one thing that we've pretty quickly found out is even though the creek is, I mean, maybe halfway up your calf, like we've waded and fished it a couple times, most of the creek is like barely deeper than ankle deep. It's a very shallow, very rocky creek, but there's still some little shoals in it every once in a while where the water's just coming down over some rocks. The deer cross that. They love crossing that for some reason. They can cross wherever they want and hardly get wet, but for some reason they love crossing those little shoals. And so Mike and I have put out cameras over the course of summer, and maybe we weren't looking right at the shoal, but this is actually what happened with a couple cameras. And this is another thing that Josh Driver talked about is if he knows there's deer in the area, sometimes he won't really move the camera, so he'll just kind of adjust them. Like maybe he moves it over here to this tree, or maybe he just turns it the other direction on a tree. And we did that with like 4 cameras that were on this creek. We moved them, instead of on this tree looking upstream, we moved them 20 yards further upstream looking back downstream because we had a better view of that little shoal that we think they're walking across, because we were like getting bits and pieces of deer on camera, or I felt like we were getting a lot of misses. Like there was one camera in particular that never really got any deer pictures as a cell camera. It never sent us a deer picture, and it was just a bunch of coons on there. And when we walked in there and checked it, there was fresh tracks on that trail. I'm like, we had it positioned wrong. It wasn't catching these deer. And looking back, it did catch a couple deer and just didn't send us the pictures because I cannot find a reliable trail or a cell camera these days. But we ended up checking the camera, and it did have a couple different deer on it. So we made some micro adjustments over the summer and rechecked them. And in one spot in particular, we had a cell camera on one side of the tree, like kind of looking down past the shoal, and then we put just a regular Browning trail camera, not a cellular camera, on the other side of the same tree, looking right at the shoal. And originally we had that cell camera on a tree, basically right where that shoal hit the bank, and we were kind of looking up past the shoal, and we were getting deer like right in front of the camera, like they were coming up out of the water, and we were getting just like fur on the camera. So we moved it like 10 yards away and kind of pointed it at the shoal, but there was another trail a little bit further downstream, so we put the cell camera looking downstream, the other one looking upstream. On that cell camera, we got some bucks. We got a decent rack buck on it, couple spikes, and a bunch of does. Bunch of does crossing that one. And I was telling Mike, because he was kind of discouraged about it. He kind of sounded discouraged about what we were getting on that camera. I was like, let's go check that other one, because I really think that there's bucks, because we were getting like small bucks crossing that. I'm like, I bet they're in a bachelor group and the bigger bucks are walking across that shoal, and Mr. Subordinate over here is having to walk through the chest deep water because Mr. Biggs over there, walking across that shoal. And so we go in there and we check that sucker, and I'll be danged if there wasn't a nice buck on it, baby. Come on. There's a couple nice deer on it, but one in particular that I'm very excited about.
Nice. It was 3 big deer, and it was like mid-July when you had them on camera.
Yeah, the first time we got them on camera was mid-July, and clean 10-point, baby. I'm talking about clean.
Which it was again, it was a really good deer, but it didn't get me like crazy excited. Like,
I got pretty excited.
I know. That's a really good deer, but it's not like at the time.
Your eyeballs aren't popping out.
Yeah,
of your
I'm
head.
like it's a mature buck, but he's not crazy, but he's a really is a really awesome buck, but not like incredible, because this kind of plays into the story a little bit later on. This is in July when we get him on camera.
Yep.
Or when y'all got him on camera.
Yep.
There was also in that bachelor group, because again, what you're mentioning for listeners that maybe didn't catch it, there's 2 trail cameras on the same tree. Like the exact same tree. They're not separate. They're on the same tree. One's facing one direction down the creek, and one's facing the other direction, kind of up the creek a little bit.
Yep.
And this happened, like the bucks that were kind of crossing a little bit more upstream through that shoal. That's where you got these mature bucks camera. And there's a really big 6-point. There's that 10-point, and then there's like a freaking Magnum 8-point that came through.
Yep.
That you only got one video of, and he's kind of like crossing even higher up than these other deer. And like you kind of slow-mo zoom in on him, like that is a very impressive deer. Like that's
and so if he was that big at that point, I wonder how big he is.
Okay, that's what kind of plays into what we're talking about.
Yeah, that 10-point. So
also, before you go into that, you kind of mentioned this, but I want you, because you've mentioned it. You kind of mentioned what a shoal is, but you mentioned shoal a ton.
Okay.
Give a visual. Visually, what does a shoal look like?
Like if you're walking up the creek and you see the water where it's like coming down over the rocks. Like where it's real shallow and it's coming down.
Not like big boulders.
No, not like a waterfall, but it's just like it's trickling over the rocks, you know, and it's just a real shallow spot. So if you're walking and the water's knee deep, and then all of a sudden you're walking up where it's coming down the rocks and it's like ankle deep, that's a shoal.
It's like the shoals is like where the bedrock kind of comes up higher in the creek, so there's like an elevation drop right there. Some rivers or some creeks, it's more aggressive than others, but in this area, it's very gradual. But it goes from like you said,
gravel.
It goes from like lower thigh deep water to literally ankle deep water.
Yep.
Like within 15 feet.
Yeah, and they're crossing that shoal.
They're crossing that shoal. So.
Yeah, exactly. So this 10-point, a little bit more about him. His frame is like, when we got that first video, his frame is very impressive. He's tall and he's wide. Like he's well outside the ears. He's got good mass. You know, he's in velvet, so take it with a grain of salt. But frame is good, and tine length. But his tine length wasn't crazy. I mean, it was good, but like you were saying, it's not crazy.
Yeah.
And then we checked another camera that he was on, the
next day.
The next day we checked the camera, but he was on that camera like 3 weeks later, I think it was, and he put some time length on, baby.
So when it's a lot better view of that deer. Which we gotta mention something from the first camera, but when he was on the second camera, I didn't even think it was the same deer.
Yeah,
like he was that much bigger. He went from like again, a really good deer, like a very, very good deer. Anybody and their mother would shoot this buck. To then 3 weeks later being like, I don't even recognize that it's the same deer. Which it's the same deer. It's exactly the same deer, but he grew a lot more. Longer main beams, much longer tines. It went from like his G4s in the first video were like, I mean, maybe 2.5 inches tall, something like that maybe. Like, you know, not very big. to like later they're 4.5 maybe, probably 4.5 inches in length.
Yep.
G2's almost doubled, G3's nearly doubled, brow times got bigger, main beams got bigger, put more mass on. And I'm like, and he's right there in front of the camera, and there's a couple of really good shots of him from the camera crossing the creek in this other spot. And I'm like, that went from being like a really good deer to like, that is a very big deer.
Yeah. He's a stud. And that 8-point that we got that one video of, he was running by himself. But I'm very curious to see because I don't know. I guess they might all be a little bit different. Like, I don't know if they hit growth spurts or whatever. I'd love to talk to a biologist about that. But I would love to see what he might have turned into, because he just swoops forward. He's huge.
Well, see, that 8-point during that same time, 3 weeks previously, is like size-wise, frame-wise, as big as the 10-point was 3 weeks later.
Yes.
So it's like you said, is it a different growth spurt, or is truly that buck had 3 or 4 more weeks of growth? Which, if that's the case, and he actually kept growing,
he will be a magnum, dude. I'm telling you.
Like, I don't even want to put a number on it, but he will be.
Put a number on it. Throw it out there.
I mean, there's a very good chance if he kept doing what he was doing, he'd be 140-inch plus 8-point.
Yeah.
I mean, legitimately. Like a legitimate deer of that size.
That's a big 8-point, baby.
And, and this 10-point's not far off, but like the 8-point was just a crazy long main beams, big G2s, big G3s, big brows, back again 3 weeks previously. And you haven't got another photo of that deer or video of that deer. Which is just crazy. Again, because it's like, okay, like if there's a deer like that running around out there, like I might need to get a spot in this club next year. Because I'm a guest. I get to go like 1 or 2 times, maybe the whole year.
Dude, if you basically live on the edge of the club, dude, you can hunt it so much. You can hunt it like every day.
Yeah, just burn the whole place down with all my scent. But
honestly,
also another interesting factor, not interesting, but interesting thing that we noticed on the very first video that we had at the 10-point and the 6-point that were kind of like hanging out together, was that the 10-point, when it was middle of the afternoon, probably 4 o'clock in the afternoon, late afternoon, and he's like walking out in that water, and he starts dipping his antlers down in the water.
Oh, that was cool.
He's not even drinking. He's like dipping one main beam in the water. He picks up, drips off, then he'll walk a little bit more, and he'll dip the other side in the water. And I'm like,
I'll put this on the video podcast so people can see it.
Yeah.
So
so another reason, go to YouTube, guys.
Yeah, go to YouTube if you want to see it. He's dipping his antlers in the water. It's cool,
and it's super fascinating. Like, it's because I've never, that's one thing. That is one of the biggest reasons why I love putting trail cameras on video mode.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of just photo mode, because first of all, this is a cool factor. I kind of see him do that.
Yeah.
But you learn so much more with a video, even if it's a 10-second long video, and some of those cameras will run like 30 seconds or 60-second long videos if you want the card space for it.
Yeah.
Don't do that if you're on private land over a bait pile. Like, you're gonna fill up a card in a week. But if you're on like travel corridors, it's not a bad idea, especially as you get closer to the rut, to do a longer video, because you might have a doe run by and 20 seconds later a buck's chasing her.
Oh yeah.
But it's like you just learn so much from the video. But that was a really cool thing that he was doing, just kind of dipping those antlers in the water, let them drip, and then dipping the other side.
That was really cool. And just another thing about where that buck is living. Again, tying this back into Josh Driver, he's living. It checks all the boxes. It's a secure area that has food, cover, and water.
Yep.
So it's an area that nobody really hunts. It's like kind of away from everything. It's close to the pinout board, which everybody, nobody goes and hunts the pinout board. So it's kind of like on that end of the property that nobody really hunts. There's a couple there are a couple areas around there, like Greenfield specifically, that people hunt pretty hard. But where he's hanging out, he's flying under everybody's radar.
Yeah.
And if you look at that area, that kind of northern end of the property, it's very diverse. So you've got different age pines, you got thin pines, you've got fresh cut over, you've got 8-9-year-old pines that are really thick underneath. So it's got everything that he needs, from a diversity standpoint. It's got oaks and everything that he's going to be eating on in the fall, but also it's got ample browse in those pines and that cut over. It's all good cover. I mean, he's in a lot of really good cover. And again, he's in that space that no one's going to really mess with him in.
Also, he's in an area that I'm wondering how much he'll shift come a little bit like closer to bow season, because bow season won't open to October 14th in this area. But he's in an area that has a lot of shade right now. It's got some thick cover, but he's definitely in an area with a lot of shade. I wonder how much he'll move when all of those leaves start falling. And it's like, okay, maybe he doesn't necessarily want that shade and kind of getting a little more kind of secluded cover, and how he potentially shifts.
Yeah.
But again, long story short, 10 points, big deer. Real big deer. And the 8 points are big deer. And the 6 point.
The 6 point's a great deer,
The
too.
6 point, he's probably he's on that verge. He's probably 3.5-year-old. He might be 4.5, or like 4-year-old deer. But just a very, very impressive 6 point. Very impressive 6 point. It's one of those things that like, not just that, but you had some other deer on camera. It's like there was a 2.5-year-old, maybe 9 or 10 point that you caught on the video from the first camera pull.
Yeah.
That like and you can tell it's a 2.5. I mean, he's just lanky legs, small little body, but he's got a really nice frame. If that deer can make it a couple years, he will be a
slammer.
He will be such a oh my god, he'll be such a good deer. Such a good deer if he can make it. So anyway, that's also really good because that's one thing I noticed is like there's probably 3 really good shooters that you got on camera. That big 8, the 10 point, and then the big 6. But you've got like a lot of like other like you call them like your up and coming bucks or up and coming bucks.
Yeah.
That like if they get another year or 2 or even 3 on them, like you're gonna like it's another great crop of deer.
Yeah.
And it comes to find out like last year they didn't kill that many deer on that place, right?
I don't think they did. So I'm gonna find out more when we do our actual work day, and I'm gonna kind of be picking everyone's brain and asking some questions. I only know of one buck that was shot last year, and out of the deer that we have on camera, he would have been like the 4th biggest. So that's the only buck I know that was shot out there. There were some does killed, but the only buck that I know of that was shot out there, and I got a picture of it, he would have been probably like the 4th, maybe the 5th biggest.
Let me tell you something funny. So last year we ran trail cameras out there, and you picked up a couple nice deer, but nothing that really like would get me fired up to pay what money you pay for in this club. Okay?
Yeah.
And it's like all of a sudden you just kind of shift a little bit on the property. And there's bucks that were probably shooters last year, no doubt, that just you never got on trail camera.
Yep.
And you had trail cameras in the vicinity of where these cameras are.
I had them close, like same ridge system in one case, and then just like on random creek crossings and stuff, and then or actually road crossings specifically last year. I had them on road crossings, and I got after season, I got a nice 10 point on camera. It could be the same deer. I'd have to go back and look and see if it.
If he did, he blew up massively.
Yeah, he might have. And it was in the same general area that I had him, but. So there was that deer, and then I got a blurry video of a buck running from some dogs.
That was a good deer.
That was a good deer. You can tell he's got a good frame, but you really can't tell anything about him. And other than that, I mean, I got a big 6 on camera last year that was kind of borderline. I don't know if it's the same 6 we got on camera this year, but he was okay. He was like, I was looking at that deer, and I was like, if he comes by, I might shoot him. Like, I'll just have to see how I'm feeling at the time.
Yeah.
But other than that, I didn't get a lot of good stuff on the camera. And I almost switched clubs, but I thought about it, and I was like, you know what? Like, I haven't put a lot of time into this club yet. I didn't run cameras out here last year like I should have. Now I've got a year of history with the place. I have a year of knowing where I hunted, but also have a year of knowing where everyone else was hunting the whole time. So now I can kind of fine-tune it. And so I think we talked about this last year. It's that, like, hey, year 2 of a spot, that's when you're like really starting to dial. You know?
That's what Kevin Tullis talked about going to another episode that we've done. Kevin Tullis, I don't remember the episode number he was on, but we did a whole episode of how he hunts hunting clubs. He's a guy from Alabama. He's been on the podcast maybe a couple times now, but he's had a ton of success killing really big deer on hunting clubs that kind of fly under the radar of a lot of other hunters. And he always talked about like year 1 was kind of like a little bit of a crapshoot. You're just kind of learning the property. You might luck into one, but really you're trying to figure out where everybody else hunts year 1, and you're taking that information into scouting for year 2, and then year 2 is when you capitalize on those big deer. And that you're kind of in that kind of space now after knowing like where a lot of guys hunted and where they didn't hunt. And the funny thing is where we're like that like the Big 10, the 6, and those 8, that 8 and everything's all on camera is a spot that we turkey hunted, and we actually found that spot during turkey season and walking through, and we're like, dude, this sets up perfectly for early season. You get the oaks there, you get that kind of little rugged terrain, you get the water, you get the pines, you get everything in this one spot. And it's like we were walking through, and there was some old rut sign, but some really big trails. I'm like, dude, this got to be the spot. And you have a camera kind of down there off that little spot and down the creek, and got some really good deer on camera. But also it shows you a little bit about having patience in a spot where, like, if you are focused on one of these creek crossings, it's like just because you're shooting at one creek crossing doesn't mean they could be crossing behind the camera.
Yeah.
Especially in this area that's fairly rocky. So, like, you don't have tracks in the water. You don't have tracks on the edge of the bank typically. So it's more so just kind of going off of, like, you got to almost get out of the water and walk up on the banks to try to find the tracks. And if it wasn't for you guys being a little more patient and kind of adjusting cameras, you probably would have never known that buck was there, at least during that time period.
Yeah, exactly. I'm really glad we got them on camera because you could tell like Mike was super excited about it, which I was happy about because before, we were getting spikes and like 3 points on camera and like random stuff like that. And he's like, well, anything's on the menu this year because he's still trying to get his first deer. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but like I promise there's bigger deer out here. Like, let's just give it some time. Yep. And yeah, dude, when I saw that 10-point walk into the frame, I was like, oh yes. Oh yes.
Yeah, I mean for sure. And it kind of goes back to like the second camera pull that we did the next day. Well, we got him, and again, he's still running with that 6-point, and the 6-point got a little bit bigger too, but didn't nearly grow as much as the 10-point did, and the 10-point's just impressive. God, it's such a beautiful deer. And I'm trying to think. You got him on camera. What was the date on that? Like the 14th?
It was mid-August.
So he's probably going. He might grow a little bit more, but he's probably just kind of going through like that hardening process before he sheds the velvet. And actually, you thought you had one deer. It might have been that younger 10-point or 9-point, whatever, that was running on the first camera pool. You thought he might have been hardhorn by then.
Yeah.
Looking at the video.
Well, no. That video was from like September 2nd.
Okay.
So it was like the night before we pulled that camera, I think is when he came through there. And it's hard to tell because it's kind of foggy, but I mean, his antlers compared to the other deer that we had, they just look like real sharp.
Yeah.
And so I think he might have shed. I'm not super, like, I don't know if I'd bet money on it or not, but because it seems kind of early. But then again, I don't know. I don't really know when they shed velvet in this area because, I didn't really run cameras out there like I should have last year. But, it just goes to show that no matter if you're hunting public or if you're hunting a club or a permission property, like you should always look at wherever you're hunting as a multi-year investment, in my opinion, because you're going to get like the better stuff out of it year 2, 3, 4. Like that's when it's going to really start paying dividends, is when you got some history with it and you're like, oh, now I know what to do, and that's kind of how I feel with the club now. So we found him. Now it's just we got to stay with him and hopefully predict where he's going to shift to. I think he's going to shift, but I don't think he's going to shift that far. I think I know where he'll be, and hopefully getting him killed. When the time comes.
Awesome.
So,
well, we get some Q&As.
Yes, sir. We got some Q&As. I'm excited. about it.
Yep. So real quick, guys. Again, this segment of these breakdown outro episodes, kind of going through some Q&As. So you guys can go down in the show notes or in the description of this video if you're on YouTube. Click the link. It says for listener Q&A, you can leave us a question that we'll try to answer on these outro episodes. We've had a bunch of them come in. They've been great. It's been one of my favorite segments, and Andrew's one of his favorite segments as well, of doing these breakdown outro episodes for you guys. So again, you can check that out. Super easy. Down the show notes, you can leave us the questions, and we'll try to answer a few of those each week on these outro episodes. So, all
right, first up, we got J.R. Posey on here. He's saying opinions or tactics on hunting ridge tops. What you got, Jacob?
So, in my opinion on ridge tops, and this is something that definitely Shane Parker can talk a lot about at a very high level, is with ridge tops, of course, like any terrain feature, they're not all created equal. With a ridge top, I think one of the most important factors, especially depending on the time you're hunting it, is where you're almost hunting like what's called a ridge top hub, where if you looked at like a spoke on a wagon wheel, where you have like the center of the wagon wheel and you have all the runners going out. Think of a ridge like that, where maybe you're not necessarily hunting like an overly long ridge, but you're hunting a ridge system where you can kind of get to that high spot where there's a bunch of other secondary points dropping off in different directions. Those are typically really good spots. You're typically going to find some kind of community or primary scrape in those areas, and also just different overall buck movement up to those spots. And that's a spot like Shane Parker, who's been on the podcast quite a bit. He's going to be on the podcast here coming up very soon. We're going to actually be hunting with him in Georgia. That's something that he's had a lot of success with. He actually was showing me a spot that we're probably going to hunt a little bit this year, where he's hunted in the past in some public, where he's killed multiple really, really, really good deer, one that was in the 170s, on a ridgetop hub like that, where it's a high spot on a ridge system. You have some small look secondary points, but also, and one thing that he talks about is finding these micro drainages that are coming up to that hub. So sometimes you can find it, you can see them on Onyx pretty well, especially on the topo map layer, but you'll see like these slight, it's almost like a ripple in the topo lines. And that little ripple that, again, doesn't look like much, that's a little micro drainage that's kind of running vertically up and down that ridge system, and a lot of times those bucks will like to use those to kind of go up and down elevation. So I know he's had a lot of success kind of hunting those specific ridge tops. But what about you?
Yeah, I would kind of second that. Outside of hunting your typical saddles and stuff that are up high on the ridges, the ridgetop hub thing is something that I'm wanting to learn more about, and it's something that we'll talk about with Shane here on an episode pretty soon. But it's a really, really interesting subject to me, because in the same way that a thermal hub can connect multiple ridges down low, a ridgetop hub, or whatever we're going to end up calling that, does the same thing but up high. And basically, if you have little secondary ridges shooting off in a bunch of directions and they all come to one point, that's something worth checking out. Maybe we'll do a video on that, like our Patreon or something.
Also,
I think we actually do have a video on that on our Patreon. I think I might have done one of those little mapping tutorial things on Patreon that covers this.
Yeah. Also, another thing about hunting ridge tops, ridges can be so different. You could have some real tight spine ridges, which may only be 20 to 30 yards wide at the very top, and they're real steep. You could have one that's a little bit more like a plateau, where it's a big, flat, wide ridge top and kind of drops down fairly steep. You could have a little bit more of a rolling hilltop. Typically, a lot of the guests that we have on the podcast that have success hunting ridges and hunting tops of ridges don't necessarily sit right in the middle of that ridge, like right in the slap middle of it, but they'll get to one edge or the other. They'll get to that one, slight drop or the other slight drop, where they can kind of shoot down the hill, down the side of the ridge, but they also can kind of shoot back up into the middle part of the ridge or up on top. And a lot of times, from what a lot of the guests, and one that comes to mind is Justin Houston, who's been on the podcast a few times, from Alabama. Sometimes those bucks will kind of side hill around, especially if they're hitting feed trees or going back to bed or even leaving a bed in the evenings. And then sometimes they'll kind of pop up on top or come over from the other side of the ridge and kind of feed up on top. So to me, that's a really good thing, not only for early season, but also can play out during the rut as well, where you kind of get off the side of that ridge. You're just over the edge of it. When you climb up your tree, you can shoot to the top of the ridge. You shoot off down to the bottom of the ridge, whether you're bow hunting or rifle hunting, and you can kind of cover two different sides of that ridge system versus sitting on top, which is fine. But if you're sitting on top, you can only see what's around you versus off the sides of the ridges, which typically you're going to see a lot of that movement just off the edge of that ridge. So, pay attention to that as well if you're scouting.
Mm-hmm. It's all about connectivity too for me, or travel direction. So, like if I were going to hunt a ridge top or some feature on a ridge top, I would have to look at it and think, where are they coming from? And where are they going to, and try to connect that from two different directions. Like the example I think we did last week, where in a certain spot they were coming up the hill to a certain area, and then they were also running the side of the hill, and where those two travel paths kind of meet, that's going to be a good spot, obviously, because you've got multi-directional travel. So same thing would apply to a ridgetop like that, and that's why the ridgetop hub thing is good, because you're having deer that are coming from multiple different directions that they could come from, and they all kind of intersect in that one spot. The same way that if you wanted to hunt people, you would go and you would hunt a major highway intersection. That's kind of like the same idea. So, and that's another thing, by the way, Josh Driver talked about, was thinking of these ridge systems as like little cities.
Mm-hmm.
Like this ridge system is a city, this is a city, and the deer travel back and forth between them, and you got to figure out what those travel routes are.
Also, one other thing while Andrew pulls the next Q&A to pay attention to is the thermals. If you're hunting ridge systems, and really if you're hunting in general, you really need to pay attention to thermals, but especially on ridge systems. If you're going to run trail cameras in a spot, based off of whether you're seeing more daylight, morning movement or in the evening movement, we really need to pay attention to the falling or rising thermal, or especially in the mornings, paying attention to a delayed rising thermal, especially if you're on a north-facing slope or if you're on a west-facing slope, specifically in the morning. A lot of people think, and a lot of people assume, and they've always heard this, and I heard this growing up as well with thermals, or I learned this from my uncles, is thermals are going to rise. It's going to rise in the morning and fall in the evening. That's true from a very simple standpoint, but it's not 100% accurate based off in areas with a lot more topography. If you're on a north-facing slope or a west-facing slope on a morning hunt, it's not, the second the sun comes up, it's not going to generate the heat and warm the air on those shaded parts of that hillside of that ridge system in order to have a rising thermal. So you will have a falling thermal for a lot longer period of time on those north-facing slopes and the west-facing slopes, because it's on the shaded side of that ridge system until that sun gets up high enough in order to warm the air and the ground around you on that side of the ridge in order for it to start rising. So you really need to pay attention to that. I've seen that the most defined place I've seen of a delayed rising thermal was in a very kind of hilly region part of Alabama that we did a scouting video on, where we were on the north face of a ridge system with some big rock bluffs and everything like that, and there was a delayed thermal there, or delayed rising thermal, to almost 11 o'clock in the morning when we got to that spot, and we were just scouting it. Also, I've seen on the flip side a delayed falling thermal, or delayed falling thermal. If you're on that west-facing slope on an afternoon sit, it's not going to be the second the sun starts setting you have a falling thermal until you're in the shade. Once you're in the shade, you're going to have that falling thermal. But on the flip side, if you decided to hunt like a east-facing slope or even a south-facing slope, but specifically an east-facing slope in the evenings, the second that, and especially if it's really mountainous or extremely hilly and a lot of elevation change, you're going to have a falling thermal a lot earlier in those areas on the east-facing slopes in the evenings than you would on a west-facing slope. The second that sun goes over the top of that ridge, and it might be 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you could start experiencing a falling thermal once that shade's been cast. And again, this only plays a factor, it majorly plays a factor if there's very little wind. If it's light and variable wind conditions, thermals are going to play a part. If you got a 10-mile-an-hour wind, the thermals are going to be a lot less impactful for you, you could say, as long as you have high enough wind speed. So just pay attention to that. I experienced that in Arkansas, hunting the mountains of Arkansas. 2:30 in the afternoon, I was on the side of one mountain on east-facing slope, and at 2:30 in the afternoon, it was already a falling thermal, and it didn't get dark till almost 6 o'clock, 6:30. So just pay attention to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next up, we got Brian Abear, Cajun French, he says. Hey, guys. Longtime listener and Patreon member here. Love how detailed you guys get without all the extra fluff and BS. My question is, I'm curious what you guys and other Deep South hunters use for mosquito repellent while hunting early season and especially while scouting. I'm in the hardwood bottoms and cypress tupelo swamps of southeast Louisiana where the mosquitoes are horrific. And most times, off with DEET just doesn't cut it. I often clip my thermocell to my pack or waist while scouting, but after a while, I can taste the fumes in my mouth, and I know that crap can't be good for you. I'm hoping other guys have something figured out better than me. To me, this is the biggest challenge of early season hunting. I can take the heat, but the mosquitoes kill me. So,
if you listened last week's outro, I talked in a very high level about this with mosquitoes because I forgot my mosquito repellent when I went in. And
didn't talk about how to prevent them. You just got jacked up.
So what I did afterwards worked extremely well. So 2 things. DEET can work great. The problem with DEET is if you get DEET on sensitive parts of your skin, you will feel it burning you. Okay, like if you get it on your face and it gets like on your lip or anything like that, you'll feel it actually burning, especially if it's like a 40% DEET. 40% DEET works pretty well. You use some of the Sawyer's products that they're 40% DEET. It works really well. But the thing I like more so than DEET, because DEET, some areas DEET seems to work really well, but you have to have a high concentration of it. If you're doing like 15% DEET, if you're in areas with really heavy mosquitoes, or just a high abundance of mosquitoes, especially like where you're talking about in the country, it's probably not going to work very well for you. So you have to have like that 40% range typically is what I've seen success with. Or another product that you can use, and this is something else that Sawyer produces, and you can pick this up from like Walmart. So you can go to Walmart or like a Bass Pro Shop and pick this stuff up, is their picaridin spray. Their picaridin sprays is a different compound. It's picaridin, which is, I believe it's an enzyme from a plant, kind of like permethrin, but maybe not. Maybe it's just a straight chemical compound. But unlike DEET, everybody smelt DEET, and DEET has a very, very strong, unpleasant odor, and it burns, okay? It burns if it gets on, again, sensitive parts of the skin, like I've already mentioned. Sometimes if people like have really sensitive skin, even if it gets on your arm, DEET will kind of go feel like a burning sensation. The picaridin doesn't have the awful smell. It's almost like a sweeter smell. I almost kind of like explain to people, it almost smells like sweet corn, which is kind of weird. It has like a sweet smell to it, but it's also safe for skin. So you can put it like on your face, you can put it on your arms, you can put it really all over you on your clothing as well, and it'll protect you from ticks and mosquitoes, and I've had tremendous success with that. So I've actually used that in areas of like Tennessee, Alabama, like kind of low-lying water areas. I mean, mosquitoes are ungodly. If you're down like that South Delta area of Mississippi or Arkansas, and also Louisiana, and also parts of Florida, South Carolina, every state. It works extremely well in that case. So I've had a lot of success with it. Again, it doesn't smell terrible, but it works extremely well because I've had issues in the past as well using like thermocells that it's almost like you need 2 or 3 of them in order to get like good coverage around you.
That's what I was going to say.
And they're still like biting you below the thermocell because all those vapors are coming up. And I've actually sat in a spot one time in Tennessee and had one in my lap. And the mosquitoes were like, okay, I'm not going to come up by your face, but I'm going to get you on the shoulders and get you on the legs and crap. I'm like, well, this sucks.
Yeah, exactly.
So I always like to have some kind of actual spray to put on, and I just soak myself in it. All my clothes, which, clothes I always spray down with permethrin. I've had okay success with mosquitoes with permethrin, but the picaridin spray works a lot better. And again, you can pick that stuff up from like Walmart and everything else. But
yeah, I was gonna say the picaridin for sure. And I've had similar problems with the thermocells, like especially breathing it in. After a while, it like really irritates my throat. So I'll sit there and I'll be coughing. And I can't help it.
Yeah.
And I'm like trying to cover my coughs and everything, so I'm not being loud. But it's uncomfortable, and you still get eat up a little bit. So.
And some people have really good success with thermocells, and that's great. That's fantastic. But one thing I've noticed, kind of like this guy here is talking about, if you're in an area, again, those like backwater areas where there's a lot of water, there's a ton of mosquitoes, it's almost like the thermocell by itself is not enough. Like you have to have something else, and that's kind of like what we're talking about. Like the picaridin works extremely well in that kind of application. So, I mean, you can use it with your thermocell if you wanted to, but typically it's like you spray that on. And also, one thing I like about it, at least with the Sawyers, I think you can get like an aerosol version, but like their version is like a pump version, so it's quiet. And I actually keep it in my bino harness. So I have a chest bino harness. I have my binos there, and I'll have the picaridin stuck in one of the side pockets. So like, after a few hours, if I'm sweating and I feel like it's kind of coming off a little bit, I'll like take it out and respray down in the stand, and you're not making any noise when you're
I love that because that little bottle's kind of made to carry with you. Like I tell people, I'm like, just go to Walmart and buy like 5 of them and put one in your backpack, one in your turkey vest, one in your truck. And just like have them everywhere.
Now, I'll tell you another thing about this. So this is another thing about like having stuff on you, because sometimes you put it on the truck when you walk in, you may sweat some of this stuff off, especially if it's on bare skin. And that's the problem about having like an aerosol can of like DEET or something, or even picaridin, an aerosol spray can. It's too loud. Like you can't put it on in the woods. Also, another thing that another picaridin product. And actually, I use this a lot more this year in this summer is the picaridin lotion.
Oh yeah,
that Sawyers makes. So you can get like the spray or the lotion. The lotion you can put, like you're not gonna put it on your clothes, but you put it on all your exposed skin, and it works amazing. And the cool thing is, I tested this out in Tennessee when we were sweating death in 115 degree heat index. Is I would try the spray on like one side and the lotion on the other side. The lotion would stay, even with the sweat, it would stay on you a lot longer than the spray would. It seemed. So that's something else. And again, you can put that in your bino harness in your backpack, and it's super easy to apply, like on your face, your neck, your arms, everything else, your hands, when you're actually in the field. And again, you don't even have to worry about the little pump spray.
Yeah. We're getting enough Q&As that we're gonna start doing 3. Per episode. This isn't really one, but I have to read it. This is from Daniel Flippick. He said, I'm sure I'm late to the party, but is Jacob going to let the world know that he also came out with an iTunes #1 hit in Richmond, north of Richmond? I'll hang up and listen.
So a lot of y'all don't know my stage name is Oliver Anthony. So, yeah. No.
Look, when it that first came out and I first heard it, I was like, dang, that's a good song, man. And I shared it on Facebook. And then someone commented, they're like, wow, I didn't know Jacob sang. And I went back and looked, I'm like, dang, that guy does look like Jacob. Holy crap.
I got to grow my beard out a little bit more.
Dude, I mean, he looked, especially like you used to buzz your hair like 2 years ago. This is before the video podcast. But when Jacob had a buzz cut, I mean, you look exactly like him.
Are you telling me all redheads look the same?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, Lord have mercy. But dude, I was so close to doing this when that song like really blew up. I almost made a post on the Southern Outdoorsman Facebook page that was like, due to Jacob's newfound music success, he'll be taking a step back from the Southern Outdoorsman. I didn't do it. I really wish I had. That would have generated a lot of comments. All right. This is from Matt Bailey. Last one. Hey guys, I'm mentoring a new hunter this year who's a friend of mine from church. He's very excited about getting in the woods and hopefully harvesting his first deer. The only thing that may make things a little bit harder is that he is deaf and he cannot hear deer approaching. He spooked a buck last season because he did not know it had walked up behind him. What would be some advice you'll have for someone who is hearing impaired? He purchased a crossbow last year but will mostly be bow hunting public land. I wish that I had a little bit more context. Like, is he like
Yeah.
literally deaf,
Or like legally deaf.
or is he like hard of hearing?
Yeah, where
you know,
you
like
could
where
use-
he needs like a hearing aid or something.
Yeah.
Or is he like literally like the world is completely silent to him? Because if it is, well, like I'm not real sure, to be honest.
If it is, bow hunting is going to be extremely hard just because from an aspect, a lot of times, depending on where you're hunting at, if you're in a big river bottom, you can see a couple hundred yards, you can potentially see them coming as long as you get your head on a swivel, but then you got to worry about a whole bunch of movement. And a lot of people don't realize, and when I read this question, it made me think, there's so many times you hear the deer before you see the deer.
Yes.
And that's
yes.
like such a big aspect of deer hunting is like hearing something and then like, kind of turning around like, oh man, there's a deer coming. There's a buck coming or whatever. Or hearing a buck grunt or something like that. So my opinion would be like let him bow hunt and bow hunt, but like I would seriously focus on gun hunting a lot more if you can own a firearm, he's old enough to own a rifle or whatever, and focus on areas where hearing's not as much of an issue, as in large clear cuts, areas you can see a whole really far. If you can sit on a big power line, any kind of long, or like if it's a gated road that you can actually hunt behind, so a lot of gated roads, at least some public land around here, you can hunt on those gated roads as long as it's not open to motorized traffic or like logging roads and stuff like that, and you can sit there like in a chair with a tripod and watch 300 yards down this roadbed, going through like a little low spot, and you can catch deer coming across. That, to me, the hearing aspect's not going to be as big of an issue because it's much more visual in those situations.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's how he can capitalize becoming much more of a focused deer hunter, is focus on his strengths, which would be his vision.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is focus on the vision. Some other stuff, like if you're kind of limited to bow hunting, some other situations that might work would be food plots. Like, honestly, food plots on public land are a lot better than people give them credit for. Especially, smaller, more out-of-the-way ones. You can have really good hunts on those. So I wouldn't overlook that if you're just trying to get him a deer. If you're some other things would be the feed tree thing can definitely work for him, especially if you're in a more open wood setting. You're not going to be like punching into the thicket, hunting that little hole in the briars, where that buck is. That's going to be extremely hard if you can't hear. But if you're in more of an open wood setting where, again, you're using more of a visual advantage, that's where it's going to come in handy.
I'll tell you something you didn't think about with that.
What?
Is his noise aspect walking in. He can't hear himself stepping on limbs and making all this extra racket, which then could set deer off again.
Yeah.
So I think that has to take into consideration as well of like, if he's going to walk into a spot, there needs to be some effort put in about like trying to like get into areas as quietly as possible. And again, that's another thing that, again, you don't really think about until you have a question like this, that so many times you're so tuned in, walking in, like trying to be quiet, trying not to brush up against branches, making a lot of racket, stepping on twigs, stepping on sticks, rolling rocks, all that kind of stuff. Which if he's truly like actually like 100% deaf, he won't be able to hear any of that kind of stuff. So he might put in all that effort and then make so much noise going in, especially like on a calm afternoon, that potentially he's blowing the area out where deer's not going to come.
Yeah, but on a feed tree, I feel like that's less of a factor, because I feel like you can be, if you're hunting, some more, let's say you're hunting more open hardwoods with thick cover adjacent, I feel like noise is significantly less of a factor in something like that, especially if you're getting in 3 or 4 hours before the deer are probably going to come in. Because they're just hearing something out in the hardwoods. As long as he's not like cracking giant limbs and banging metal together and whatnot, I think he ought to be fine. Even if he's kind of loud walking through, the leaf duff and everything, I don't think that'd be a giant issue. Now, if he does have some hearing, like there are, but he's just like has, I don't know what the term would be, like hard of hearing, I guess, where he's like he has a hearing impairment, but he's not completely deaf. I mean, there are things like obviously like hearing aids or whatever, but like game ears or whatever, something like that might help. But yeah, I don't know. That's a very unique question, man. I wish you luck. That's awesome that you're getting him out there and taking him hunting. That's probably really awesome for him. So good on you for doing that. And I hope you guys get one this year. So I'd be very curious to have you right back in and kind of maybe give us a little more context and let us know how your season goes, because I would love to know if y'all end up getting on some deer.
Yep. Now we got some new reviews we got to read.
Yes, sir. We got some new reviews. So, Jacob, you want to give them the spiel on all
So, of course,
iTunes?
appreciate everybody that's been leaving us reviews. So, on iTunes and on Spotify, you can leave us as a 5-star review. They don't allow written reviews. But if you listen on an Apple product, iPhone, iPad, something like that, if you could take 2 seconds out of this podcast and go leave us a 5-star written review, specifically a written review. I mean, if you just leave us a 5-star review, I'll be super happy. But if you can leave us a written review, that's really awesome because we love not only reading it, but it also helps us out a little bit on the show. We're about to hit, I think we're one away currently, at least as we're recording this, from 1,050 reviews.
Yep, that's right.
But it's awesome getting some of the feedback from you guys, and that's another huge thing you do. Of course, always to share the show. That's the biggest thing you can do to help the podcast. Share the show with friends, buddies, the family, the whole 9 yards. But also, if you leave us a written review, it's also a huge deal. So we try to read off some of the new reviews. It's been a few weeks since we've read some, but we've had quite a few come in recently, so we'll kind of knock some of those out.
So, hooked up. This is from Justin, Deep South Bama. Hooked on phonics for deer hunting. That's a Michael Pike reference for all the listeners out there. Absolutely love this podcast. I've listened to all or almost all of the 500 plus episodes with these guys. I feel like I've learned so much about hunting alongside these guys. The questions they ask are these extremely successful hunters down here in the South leaves me with barely any questions at all. If you still have questions about something, simply reach out to them, and they are great, down-to-earth guys that will help in any way. From hunting terrain features, scent control, hunting thermals / wind, bedding, feed trees, and so much more, this podcast will make you more educated in the woods. If you have just a little bit of luck, which I don't have, you will definitely be more successful. Thank you guys for all you do for us Southerners, and even making a career change to help educate us Southern hunters, or us Southerners, to learn how to chase that whitetail. Happy hunting and roll tide. Maybe I need hooked on phonics. I kind of struggled with that one. But Justin, appreciate that, man. That was a fantastic review.
Roll tide.
War Eagle, baby. There's a freeze warning down in the plains this year. So, all right, next up.
All right. Oh, this is a great one. So this title, this is 5-star review. Dusty off my dad's teachings from your podcast. This is from T Cook 911. At the 1436 mark, you guys have no idea how refreshing it is to hear all the conversations you have between you guys and your guests. I have a lot of catching up and listening to the podcast. I have a lot. I can't talk.
Hooked on phonics worked for me.
Yeah, we need to save that. We need to save that as a button on here and just start hitting it.
Oh my gosh, that would be so good.
So I have a lot of catching up and episodes to listen to. I'm 49 years old and grew up hunting everything with my dad at a camp he started in the 70s. After he passed, hunting that area hasn't been the same. I am 3 years into my own 180-acre lease with potential to purchase. I'm going back to my hunting roots and tactics, which line up with many topics you discuss, which is helping me tremendously by sparking memories and tactics I have forgotten over the years. I am more excited now than I can't talk.
Man.
I can't read. I'm more excited now than I have in many years. My 18-year-old daughter is even seeing my excitement. She has hunted with me her entire life, and she has been hooked since harvesting her first deer at 7 years old. Please keep what you're doing and never change. If you ever want to come to South Mississippi, kind of names off some places, give me a call anytime. Hopefully I'll be able to share a listener success story harvest from my daughter this coming year using information I gained in the short time of... What is that?
He meant to say listening.
Okay, it doesn't help, guys. I can't read.
Jacob can't read.
And also when y'all misspell stuff tremendously bad. But anyways,
it's just a typo.
But yeah, in the short time of listening and following your various channel formats.
Man, you
struggle
with that. That's an awesome review. I really hope that you get a deer with your daughter, man. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you writing that in, and keep us posted on how you do. Definitely reach out if you have some success this year.
Yep, I gotta read this one. So if you're a long-time listener, guys, we've had some historical reviewers. Okay, it's always been the reviews. Always leave us new reviews, and this is one of our favorites by far. This is from Thicket Cricket, who's a long-time reviewer, a long-time listener to the podcast. 5 stars. 601 time to get thick in the thicket. Won't be long now. Nice, crisp, cool mornings. Leaves falling. Oh, leaves falling.
Golly!
I'm dragging your target buck across your back 40 fence. Hashtag fear the chirp.
Man. I'm not gonna let you read any more of these.
That's hilarious.
Golly. All right. I want to get like Chat GPT or whatever. You know how it can or is that the one that can draw you pictures, or is it the Adobe one?
It's the
I'm gonna get the AI thing to draw a picture of like a bow hunting cricket and see whatever scary picture it comes up with. I'm sure it'd be horrifying. We tried to get one of those AI things to draw a picture of Jacob. And
the ginger bow hunter?
I was like, draw a picture of the ginger bow hunter, and what it spit out was horrifying.
Had 3 eyes. The bow was
it spit out a monster.
Yeah, the bow that looked like something from a horror film that doesn't even make sense.
It's so scary. All right, Southern Fusion Hunting. This is from Deep Step 11. 5 stars. The most relatable hunting information out there for the true Southern outdoorsman. A great mix of guests from across the country. These guys pull every tactic and attempt to apply it to the land of the pine thicket. Fantastic work, boys. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Appreciate all the reviews, everybody. We'll get back to reading those every week, especially now that we're rolling into deer season. And hey, by the time this drops, deer season's underway, and I know Georgia. So y'all definitely be writing in with your listener success stories. We're going to be looking out for them. So excited to see the brand new listener success stories rolling in from this year.
Which you can fill that out in a lot of these episodes in the show description. It'll have a link on there to fill out a listener success form from our website, or you can just go to the southernoutdoorsman.com, and there's a tab on the website talking about listener success stories, and you can fill it out, send a photo in, a story, and we're actually going to be doing monthly drawings with a couple different companies to give away some free gear from new listener success stories that come in each month. So we're going to start, even if you kill deer in September, you can submit it. It'll go into the October drawing. We'll do one for October, November, December, and probably in January as well. Yep. So super excited about that. Love seeing the news stories. We've been posting at least 2 to 3 listener success stories on Facebook and Instagram every week now for the whole summer. It's been awesome kind of posting some of those from last year. We look forward to doing the same thing this year. So hopefully this episode, again, Josh Driver's episode, has been extremely impactful for you. If it has, again, share the show, guys. Share the episode, share the show, friends and family, the whole 9 yards. We want to hear about it. We want to see it. We want to get other people that haven't heard the show tune into the show and see if it impacts them as much as it's impacted you for this season. So appreciate y'all listening. Appreciate y'all watching on YouTube, and we'll catch you back here for the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast.